Video discusses the theme of South Africa and of transitional spaces within the dream house. So in the dream house, the characters, the context, and the storyline are all in a state of transition and change. When Higginson talks about his novel, he says that the landscape is in transition. It's not a farm, it's not a gated community. It's in a state of both renewal and decay. The buildings coming out of the mud are half new, half ruins, and that's where South Africa feels to me to be. So we'll explore how the dream house is an allegory for South Africa a bit later. But what Higginson is saying is that Dwaleni is not a farm. Patricia and Richard are moving out. It's no longer a place where she bred ponies or where he worked or looked after the farm or anything like that. But it's not yet what Look Smart wants it to be, which is a gated community and a place for the wealthy. It's in an in-between space, in transition. It's in a state of renewal, where they're building something new, and it's in a state of decay, where Patricia, you can see, she talks about the house a lot, where it's a dark, gloomy place, dank like a cave. It's also in a place of decay. Their buildings coming out of the mud, where they're trying to replicate the farmhouse, and they're not fully built yet, they're half new, but they still have ruins. The rain has come down, the mist, the weather has eroded them a little bit. They look kind of like they're decaying, like they're ruins. And Higginson's saying that's what South Africa feels like. We're building new things. We're coming out of this apartheid. We're trying to strive for equality and unity, but we've still got a lot of ruin. We've still got a lot of decay to get through first. So he wrote the novel to examine the space between a bleak outcome and a redemptive, hopeful one. There's a bleak outcome in one place where, in terms of the dream house, we can talk about Grace's death. Look Smart never really recovered from that. Patricia's not happy on the farm. Richard is an evil man. But there's also a redemptive, hopeful outcome where Patricia and Look Smart are able to make up, at least partially, and they're able to move forward with their lives. Patricia can move to Durban and leave Richard, send him to a home, or put him in a separate room far away from her. So there is also hope in the novel, but they're not in either space right now. They're not in this bleak space, but they're also definitely not in this redemptive space yet. So if we were to talk about a possible essay on South Africa and on transitional spaces, I would divide it into a few different paragraphs. I'd do one on Look Smart's transitional space within his childhood, where he felt he was a part of Patricia's life in the farm, in the luxurious farmhouse, as well as in his little poor farm hut, but he didn't really feel as if he fitted in either of those places. Then you could talk about how Look Smart is in a bit of a middle space in terms of the truth, because he knows more than Patricia did in the beginning, but he doesn't know the full truth. Look Smart also Patricia also undergoes quite a lot of transition, where she goes from believing how the past is not important at all to realizing that we all must re-examine the past and find our own truth to help us move forward. And then lastly, probably the most important part of this would be the transitional space and the in-between space in terms of Dwaleni as a farm and South Africa as a country. So if we look at Look Smart, he's in the very middle space regarding his sense of belonging as a child. So he feels partially as if he belongs in the farmhouse. To him as a child, it was the very picture of luxury. His relationship with Patricia, viewed as a child, he wanted to impress her. He looked up to her, and she loved him as a child, or at least that's how he felt when he was a child. For her, he was the receptacle of all her hope. He was the son, my son. She says that somewhere in the novel. But as Look Smart grows up, he realizes that it wasn't all he thought it to be as a child. She wasn't just, or to him, she didn't just love him because she loved him. She liked the relationship because she was the one in power, and their bond was predicated on the power dynamics of the apartheid, where she feels superior to him, and she has an almost paternalistic relationship with him. And you can use that quote about him feeling like her toy monkey with the battery up its arse. And so perhaps as a young child, Looksmart did feel as if it was a kind of mother-son relationship, quite an equal relationship where they both loved each other. But as Looksmart grew up, and especially after Grace's death, he begins to realize that it probably wasn't as simple a relationship as he thought. It was probably a lot more of Patricia being a power figure. And because of the relationships, the dynamics that she grew up in during apartheid. So Looksmart kind of feels at home and has a childhood in Dwaleni in Patricia's farmhouse, but he also belongs in his mud hut. He's proud of his heritage. He's proud of being Piwankosi and Glovu and not just Looksmart. But he doesn't feel like he fully belongs in that mud hut with his mother. He feels like he has gone to a private school with mostly white pupils. It's quite a privileged school. He had a good education, and he spent time with Patricia. So he, in a way, he feels like he's surpassed his mother. And Patricia sees that he had a need to diminish the earth he came from because he's seen better. So he sees that this mud hut is not everything. And he's in a very in-between space because he doesn't fully belong with his mother, nor does he fully belong with Patricia. And he says something, or it's written somewhere in the book where he says he never felt like he belonged, not with his mother and certainly not with Patricia. So yeah, he went to a privileged school, white pupils. He spent time with Patricia in a house that initially was the very picture of luxury. But he also spent time in this small, poor hut, in this mud hut on the farm. And he feels that because he alternated between these two realms of society, he feels isolated from both of them. And this is his transitional space, his middle space. And then if we look at Looksmart in terms of the truth, he does undergo a transition because he does learn to move on from his past, at least a little bit. He learns that Patricia is sorry for her mistakes and that she didn't purposefully, well, she hopes she didn't purposefully view Grace as less than human. She didn't completely neglect Grace. And this allows Looksmart to move forward. So initially he returned to the farm out of hate. He accuses Patricia of viewing Grace as less than human, as wanting to save her seats, and he's angry and he wants to hurt her. But when she acknowledges that maybe she got it wrong, that she should be better, his hate starts to lessen a little bit, and he leaves the farm feeling a bit more content and hopeful for the future. But he still doesn't know the full truth. He doesn't know that Grace was pregnant and some of the other things that Beauty knows. And so he does leave the farm with gaps inside him, which means that he's still in a sort of transitional state because he's learning to move forward, but he's not quite there yet, where he's not quite reached the point where he's got proper, open, honest relationship with his family. And he doesn't know the full truth, so he's not completely at the end of his journey, even though he may never know the full truth, which means that he's left in a bit of a middle space, an in-between space. Patricia also does undergo a lot of character development, a lot of transition. Initially, she goes from believing that the past is not important, that backward glances only crack the neck, the past doesn't amount to much in the end. But then she moves, when Looksmart confronts her, she moves on to accepting her role in the past, acknowledging that maybe she got it wrong, maybe she did do something and choose her seats over Grace, even subconsciously. And she acknowledges that we must all strive to find a version of the truth that allows us to move forward. So this is her transition. She learns the truth about the past, about Grace's death, about her relationship with Looksmart, about Richard, how he's not just this demented husband, that he's actually, well, at least according to Looksmart and to Grace, an evil man. And she learns the truth about herself, that she's not as innocent in her events of the past, that she did play a role in creating her current circumstances. She learns to question her recollection of the past. She learns, at first she thought that, Grace's death was a whole sorry affair. At first she thinks, I did everything I could for Grace, but as Looksmart confronts her, she learns to question that maybe I'm not remembering everything exactly as it was. And she strives to find the truth for herself, as beauty tells her to do. She accepts that there's a mystery that must run through all things. So she accepts that there's no one truth, and we're not all going to suddenly have great clarity and be able to see everything perfectly. There is a mystery within everything. And then if we look at the transitional space in terms of Dwaleni, Dwaleni is currently, well, before Looksmart returned, it was a single farmhouse. It was where Patricia and Richard grew old, but it's now being transformed to become a gated community where the wealthy and the elite will live and escape from, Looksmart says something about the black crime or the criminals. And it's not quite there yet, but it's in the transitional state. It's getting there to that point. So we're moving from racial segregation, where there was white owners on the farm, there was black farm workers, and because of the legacy of apartheid, and especially during apartheid, these white owners, the Wileys, viewed the black farm workers as subordinate. We're moving on from that because now we see that Looksmart is starting to control the process of the transition of Dwaleni. So he's obviously not this complete subordinate anymore. So we're moving on from the racial segregation, and we're moving to class and wealth segregation. So now the rich and the wealthy, not necessarily the white, but the rich, will be able to move to Delaney, to this gated community, and escape the crimes of the city. So just as the farmhouse is being reproduced with slight variations all across the valley, the inequality of the past will not be erased, but merely changed to reflect a class hierarchy rather than a racial one. So just as Dwaleni is changing from racial segregation to class segregation, South Africa's inequality is changing from racial to class hierarchy. So Dwaleni is an allegory for South Africa. It's almost like a metaphor for South Africa. It subtly tells and reflects the state of South Africa in the state of Dwaleni. Apartheid is abolished. We know that apartheid has ended, but there's still inequality, there's still segregation in the country. So times have certainly changed. That's a nice quote, but we still haven't reached unity and equality yet. And Looksmart says somewhere in the book that the world still runs not on charity, not on kindness, but on money. And he recognizes that, but he doesn't do much about it. He's allowed himself to grow out of his circumstances, but he's capitalizing on this. He's part of the developers on the farm who are creating a gated community. So he's not completely free of fault about this. South Africa's vision of a rainbow nation is nothing more than a mirage, and the country still has a violent and troubled past to resolve. So we're not, well, according to Higginson, we aren't going to immediately one day wake up and here's a rainbow nation. We still have a lot of work to do, but we have moved on, at least partially, from the apartheid. We still have a lot of violence, a lot of trouble to work through and to resolve and to acknowledge. And then we need to build our story, our narrative for ourselves and move forward, and then we can possibly look towards a more hopeful future. So Dwaleni and South Africa have transitioned to overcome the racism of apartheid, but they have not yet reached a place of equality and unity. Just as Dwaleni there's still horrors on the farm, there's still inequality, there's still people who are inferior to others. This is the same in South Africa, and that's what Higgins is trying to say. He's like comparing the farm to the position that the country is in right now. If we looked at some quotes, here's some quotes on South Africa and on class versus race and on this segregation. Looksmart feels like he's still an intruder in his own land, condemned to arriving at places where he'll never quite belong. So this is quite a good quote for Transitional Spaces. He feels like he'll never quite belong anywhere. He feels like people like her are still sitting in their houses, people like him are still looking in, but he has improved his circumstances from apartheid. He's now working to develop Dwaleni, so he has gained some power. Hope is a flag waved in a country that is yet to exist. This one, you could use it, certainly, but it's quite hard if you're arguing that Higginson is writing about the space between a bleak outcome and a hopeful redemptive one, because by the end of the novel there is some hope. So it's not completely yet to exist, this hope, but it's hard earned and it's not completely optimistic. And here when Patricia says, I gave you everything you asked for, I want you to go to boarding school, and then Looksmart said, but I came to sleep in my mud hut. So Patricia was uplifting him in quite a paternalistic way. She helped him, certainly. She sent him to boarding school. She tried to improve his life, I guess, in some ways, but she didn't do everything in her power, is what Looksmart's saying. And again, this shows the middle space where Looksmart is at this privileged boarding school, but he also lives in a mud hut. Here's what they call an gated community to flee the crime. This is Looksmart's view, where he's in in-between space. He doesn't think he fitted anyway, not with her and certainly not with you. Looksmart is in an in-between space, as is South Africa, moving from racial inequality to class inequality and hopefully, possibly one day to equality, but Higginson doesn't think this is very likely. Richard says about beauty, he says her mistake is in thinking that she is like him, or more specifically that he is like her. Richard has still completely apartheid mindset, very racist, and Higginson uses him to show that there are still people like that out there. We're not completely moved on from the racial and evilness of the past. Looksmart wipes the mud off his hands onto the other man's anorak, onto Richard's anorak. Looksmart, now this black man, who Richard still sees as inferior, has now wiped the mud onto Richard's anorak. And Richard is this weak old man who's now riddled with dementia. And the act of Looksmart wiping his hands onto Richard's anorak shows that times have changed. Looksmart would never do this as a child or during the apartheid times. Becky holds her father's gun. Her father we know he's an Englishman, he's a white man, but now Becky is holding the gun. Becky has the power and is going to shoot the dog, who in the past, dogs were symbols of power, and just as the dogs killed Grace, they were symbols of, evil and of white superiority. But now that Becky has the power to shoot the dog, we show that the power dynamics have changed. So I've written an essay on transitional spaces, which is up on my Stuvia, where the link to that is in the description. So if you'd like some more help or discussion with that, have a look at that essay.